Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 174, Io 534a to b. Socrates is explaining to Io that Io doesn't have a techne of rhapsody or poetry, but rather a divine power. And he's given two analogies to illustrate this divine power. The first one is using a magnet. A magnet has a divine power of attraction. It's divine, I presume, because it's inexplicable. And the divine power can be transferred to iron rings. And the iron rings themselves, with divine power, can attract other iron rings. And we can end up with a chain of iron rings connected to a magnet. And that we can assume is like a muse inspiring poets who inspire rhapsodes who inspire their audience. This is all well and good, but then Socrates carries on with another analogy. And in this one, the poets, according to the poets themselves, pluck poems from the gardens of the Muses the way a bee collects honey. And in this one, it doesn't look as though we're still talking about divine power. What we are actually talking about are the poems themselves. The poems are in the gardens of the Muses, and poets look around the garden and find a poem, and then when they appear to be composing the poem, they're actually simply reciting a poem which they have found elsewhere. It is not their own work. And this is what Socrates means when he says that the poets lack reason when they are inspired. In fact, they don't think about the composition of any of their poems. They simply find them in the gardens of the Muses. And then what happens to them? They are transmitted from the poets to the rhapsodes. And again, the rhapsodes don't have to think for themselves, apart from learning the poems. And then the rhapsodes perform the poems, and in this way the poems are transferred to the audience. So we have a different analogy for a different thing. This is not the divine power, this is simply the poems themselves. It's interesting to note that the notion of a divine power is quite poetic, it's inspirational, but the analogy fitting it is quite dry and scientific. The idea of magnets and iron rings doesn't sound very inspiring, but it is a correct analogy. The other one, the bee and honey analogy, does not fit the divine power. It fits the notion of copying poems from elsewhere without any thought. This means that the notion itself is uninspiring. It's bordering on criminal, although plagiarism in the ancient world was unknown. They simply copied without any problem. Of course, the analogy doesn't reflect reality, and we shouldn't accuse the poets themselves of plagiarism. They clearly thought up poems themselves with a bit of inspiration from other poets. The only point I want to make here is that one analogy is dull and scientific but accurate, while the other analogy is poetic and inspirational but false. There are several examples in Platonic dialogues of this sort of contrast between two speeches, two analogies, two examples of anything, where one is scientific and dull but accurate, while the other is more rhetorical or poetic, as in this case, but it is an analogy either of something which is false or something which is not to be admired and clearly detracts from the ability of the subject of the analogy. The bees are analogous to poets, and the poets are represented here as people who take poems and simply transmit those poems. That's all they do. And this allows Socrates to say that they are mindless. But this idea of mindlessness is also applied to the first analogy, where magnets attract iron rings. The iron rings have no mind of their own. Io evidently doesn't react to any of this, so Socrates carries on. Socrates has just said that the poets say true things. In other words, the bee analogy is absolutely correct. Kufon gar chrema poietes estin, kai ptenon kai hieron, kai u proteron hoioste poien prin an entheostegenetai, kai ekphron, kai ho nous meketien auto ene. For a poet is a light thing, and there is actually a word for thing in the Greek. This isn't simply the neuter singular. For poet is a light thing and able to fly and holy, and he is not able to produce. A poet is a producer, but a poem is a production. He is not able to produce until he becomes enthused and out of his mind, and the mind is no longer in him. Now, the poet is enthused, has God in him, according to the first analogy, the magnet. The divine power is what enters the poet and is what makes him attract others who then also acquire the divine power. But this is not the case in the second analogy. A poet has no need of a divine power in order to take a complete poem from the gardens of the Muses and use it as if the muse is speaking through them. A bee is a light thing which can fly and is very often considered a holy animal, and this is why those characteristics are applied to the poet as well. But again, do poets really need to be light and able to fly simply in order to take a complete poem from the gardens of the Muses? Well, yes, they do, because the gardens of the Muses are not here. You have to fly off to get to them. If it weren't for Socrates saying that the poets are mindless when they're doing this, I would have said that this is an analogy of a poet actually using his intellect, flying off up into the intellect in order to compose a poem. But Socrates is presenting it as if the poet is flying off in order to take something already composed by, we don't know who, in the gardens of the Muses. Heostan tuti echetok tema, adunatos pas poien anthropos estin kai chresmoden. So long as he has this thing, and Socrates uses a different word for thing this time, so long as he has this thing, any man is unable to produce, to make poetry, and to sing oracles. So there is a thing which any person has which prevents them from producing poetry or delivering oracles, and this thing is nous, the last noun mentioned. But why would any man be unable to produce poetry? We're talking about producers. The poetai are the ones who poiusin. They are the ones who produce. In other words, they make poems. The problem is that poien can also mean simply to do, to make, to produce, in general, not simply in the field of poetry. So this sentence sounds like any man is unable to do anything so long as he has intellect, intelligence, which is manifestly false. It's as if Socrates is claiming that not only does Io lack a techne because he has divine power, but any person apparently with a techne actually doesn't have that techne, because any techne requires intelligence, and in fact they can't do what they claim to do until they lose the intelligence. It has to go somewhere. It should be out of them. They should be out of their mind. It's very important to note that Socrates uses wordplay all the time. He doesn't mind making a hash of any argument. This is absolute rubbish, what he's saying, but we should see how he does it. In this particular case, he's working on the ambiguity of the verb poien, to produce, to make poetry, or to produce simply to make or to do. Plato even gives us a clue, us the readers, a clue that Socrates is playing about by Socrates' strange use of thing. The poet is a thing, in that case a chrema, and the nous is a thing, a ktema. I'm wondering whether there is any deeper meaning in the difference between these two words for thing. A chrema is something one uses, so a poet is something one uses, while a ktema is something possessed, and that means the nous, the intellect, is something possessed, not particularly used.